All right, here we go. Welcome to this video on decimating dating methods and the so-called heat problem with Matt N. and Donny B. from Standing For Truth Ministries. Let's get right into it.
Here we go. I
You're
hope
good.
you enjoyed the presentation. Can you hear me good?
Yeah, you
Okay.
sound good now.
Sorry. Yes. This presentation is going to go over the radiometric dating in the age of the Earth because we know that the only reliable evidence that they have that the Earth is millions of years old comes down to radiometric dating. That said, there are 4 assumptions that go into this. All of them deal with radiometric dating at the root of them, right? The Earth is billions of years old because it formed billions of years ago based on radiometric dating. The fossils are millions of years old based on the geologic column and radiometric dating. So as you can see, radiometric dating is the base, the understanding that how things decay and the decay rate that they present tell us now that the Earth is old, right? Well, when did this happen? This was a long time ago in 1902 that Ernest Rutherford basically discovered the radioactive elements, right? But it wasn't until like the 1930s that American chemist Borden Boltwood integrated that these dates were actually true based on the radioactive series that they decay into, meaning he noticed that whenever there was uranium or thorium, that there was always lead that was present in the rocks. So he said there must be a half-life decay, which these things are breaking down into to the proportion of lead that we see in these meteors and rocks that are in the Earth. And because of that, he calculated that if the uranium is what started out and it decayed into the lead, then the Earth must be around 2.2 billion years old. This was a drastic increase of time from the age of the Earth before that time. So again, we need to start with the assumption that the decay rates that we see started with pure uranium. Okay. So again, we see that the time changed in the 1920s. The age of the Earth crept up to 3 billion years from the age that was before that was set. But again, if we look over here, what did they say? Well, the accepted ages for rock layers was set in the 1830s. So a long time ago, 120 years later, radiometric dating ages were accepted, but only if they matched the geologic column. So we see that they already had the mindset of deep time, and they needed things to prove it and validate it. So radiometric dating became that thing that they needed to help validate. Now, of course, the age of the Earth is even older because of Zychron crystals and testing that, which we'll get into. But the age of the Earth now is at 4.54 billion years old. So when we look at a chart and we see this decay series, we can see it all the way up here from uranium-238, and it decays into thorium. And then as you can see, the decay rate keeps going. That decays into the next one, to the next one, all the way down into lead, which is a stable element. It's no longer radioactive. So the assumption has always been that when a supernova or the Big Bang occurred, there was nothing but pure uranium, and that all of the elements that we see on Earth and in stars and on the moon and on meteorites, it resulted from the decay of uranium. So again, that's starting with an assumption. They want deep time to be true, so they wouldn't assume that all of these other elements were created at exactly the same time, because that's the uniformitarian belief, is that everything that we see now is you take it backwards in time, and that's what's the most true, right? Nothing can change that. Therefore, they don't believe in accelerated nuclear decay. They don't believe that the rates can ever be changed. They believe in uniformitarianism, and they believe that everything started out as uranium. So that is key to understanding what's going on. But there's a problem with that idea, which we have. It's called the lead paradox. There's more lead than can be accounted for by the age of the Earth, and matter of fact, the age of the entire universe. So meaning, if uranium really was decaying into lead, then why is there so much lead? There's more lead than there should be. It's a paradox for them to comprehend and to grasp what's going on. And the reason why we as young Earth creationists know that there is no problem is because the lead paradox that they have is starting with the assumption that God would have only created, if there is a God, that he would have created only uranium and everything would have decayed, right? Those would be theistic evolutionists. are just evolutionists in general. We would say no. Walt Brown predicted, matter of fact, that no, the elements were formed by a piezoelectric effect, and they all formed at the same time. That's how God would have created these things. And his predictions we'll get into in a minute. But, sorry, that one should be in a different place. We can see that there are such things as accelerated nuclear decay. We've seen it in laboratories, we've seen it in experiments, and we've seen it in observational things like in nature. We've seen one of them in particular in Africa, I believe it is, but we'll get into that one as well soon. But here's one that gives you a billion-fold acceleration of nuclear radioactivity in a laboratory. He says, this is John, what is this? Woodmarep. Here I report the experimental demonstration of radioactive decay rates accelerated by an astonishing 9 orders of magnitude. This acceleration can occur under beta decay. More recently, beta decay has been experimentally demonstrated in rhenium to osmium system. So this method is one of the isotope clocks used by uniformitarian geologists to supposedly date rocks. The experiment involved the circulation of fully ionized iridium in the storage ring. So here we read, the ions were found to decay to a measurable extent in only several hours, amounting to a half-life of only 33 years. This represents a staggering billion-fold increase over the conventional half-life, which is 42, what is this, giga-annum a billion with 10 to the 9th power, which is 9 zeros following a 10. That's how fast we witnessed rapidly decaying things in observational. So when people say, there's no such thing as accelerated nuclear decay, it would destroy all life and everything. Well, we have these things that are already been observed. So when Walt Brown made this prediction, none of this existed yet as far as observational science, right? There was no concept of like, well, we know that in stars that was believed that, heavy elements could be formed. But Walt Brown predicted that they could form even on Earth. And that's what we actually found. And they don't form in stars. Now we know that they can't produce anything of these super heavy elements that was predicted beforehand. And we know because of the Proton 21 laboratories in Ukraine, when we go through the studies and we witnessed what they did, they would put a piece of metal in a chamber, copper or something, and they would take a piece of lightning and they would strike it, and it would form different elements based on the Z-pinch was a high voltage form of electricity like lightning, and it would burst and it would form different elements. But the unique thing is when it would form these elements, they would rapidly decay. And down here on the bottom, you can see that I highlighted the long-living isotopes of super heavy chemical elements are found in the products of laboratory nuclear synthesis. So what that means is they produced super heavy elements and they rapidly decayed into the elements that we now see on the Earth. So it didn't just produce uranium, which was predicted by the evolutionary model, and then had to decay from there. Instead, it produced all of the elements that we have on Earth today in the same proportions that we have. So when we see it and we see, cobalt and we see thorium and we see uranium in something, we go, wow, look at that. The proportions are exactly what we are seeing. And another unique thing is that we're seeing them on the crust of the Earth, not deeper inside the core of the Earth, which we had always thought and expected the Earth was running by. The core, the nuclear synthesis and the production of uranium powering our Earth's core is no longer true either. But what happened is the rate study team came along later, and they noticed that the decay of uranium and lead is a slow process. They've already known this, right? But since helium migrates out of rock rapidly, there should be very little to no helium remaining in zircon crystals, because crystals store and trap and capture things inside of it, so they can't really get out. But as you know, helium can seep out because it's very thin. That's what's in helium balloons. So even if you were to wrap them in something like aluminum foil, it'll slowly leak through because it's a very slippery element. So the Zychron crystals, though they can trap things, it should still seep out. They can't hold on to it anyway. Nothing can hold on to it for a very long period of time. So why is there still so much helium in granite and these Zychron crystals? One explanation that was given by the Ray team is that radioactive decay was accelerated at some point in the past. We say this was during Noah's flood. So a prediction was made, and the numbers were run based on the diffusion rates at 1,000 degrees from helium in lower rock layers. How long would it take for that to seep out? And the creation model predicted, which would be on the data line right up here, which was what was observed. And the uniformitarianism was not met by a factor of 100,000. They were off by that much. Our model lined up perfectly if you take it and you go assume around 6,000 years, give or take 2,000. And the numbers lined up well with our model, but it didn't come anywhere close to the uniformitarianism thing. So when we look at this rate topic, this is they clearly confirmed with the numerical predictions of the creation model. And between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, this nuclear radioactive decay acceleration happened. And now we have experiments that can show, and observationally, that these things really can decay rather fast. And here is going back to that Proton 21 Laboratories, which shows that the decrease in the activity of radioactive isotopes of cobalt and silver and zinc. So they showed that these radioactive elements can decay rapidly into these elements, and they can decay even further from there based on temperature. And that will lead us into what we're going to be talking about next. Oh, here's another chart that shows the actual decrease in radioactivity in the experiment. You can see the percentages are extremely high. So this isn't just like some young earth creationist, work that's being done. The Proton 21 Laboratories had nothing to do with the topic at all. They were actually trying to work on generating energy, an energy source that's going to be more efficient in the future for productions of everything. So does radiometric dating prove the age of the Earth, right? So the rate experiment, this was just from earlier. I'm sorry, it's a full page of it. Here's another one. Geoscience Research Institute stated, is there any hard physical evidence that would corroborate the large magnitudes of decay rates apart from laboratory studies? And this person said, yes, I believe the answer is yes. And this is the one I was mentioning earlier that they found in Africa. In addition to the radio halo evidence found in various rock formations throughout the world, which is by Walt Brown in 1990s, the Oklo natural reactor phenomenon found in Gabon, Africa, contributes meaningful insights into the evaluation of their radioactive decay rate consistency. Because what they did is when they found this, they actually assumed that humans must have lived hundreds of thousands of years ago to make this nuclear reactor. That's what they have to assume, because these things they believe never happened naturally on their own. So they had to assume that humans must have lived at some time in the past and created civilizations like we have today. And then global warming came and destroyed them. But in the process of it, we had nuclear fusion going on. We had natural reactors that we had produced. So that was the rescue device for that one, is just assume that we've already been here before and we destroyed ourselves, probably with nuclear war. And that was their only rescue device for why they could see that. And then we have the perplexing 90% of all radioactivity on the Earth's crust on the continents. Like, why would that be, right? We have in the study here where they talk about Australia has abundant uranium and thorium resources, with about 33% of the world's resources of uranium and 20% of the world. See, look at this, 53% of the world's radioactive materials are just in Australia alone. 90% of the uranium and thorium are concentrated on the continents. So what are they doing on the crust of the Earth? If these things are powering the Earth's core and they're slowly moving up to the surface through convection and being dumped out at the mid-Atlantic ridge and forming into mountains slowly over millions of years, this would be the opposite of what we would see, especially considering they say our Earth is young. This would be indicative of the Earth being extremely old, and that would be another paradox for evolution, but we know that is not true. Then we have the observational science that when we look at rocks that have opposite sides dating at different ages. And then to jump into the most important things, we're going to talk about the crust of the earth, the argon ages, the volcanism, and why things date the way that they do. So this is the first picture that we're going to revisit in a moment, just to make sure that you guys can see it. But what it turns out is that the excess amounts of argon is a direct function of both the hydrostatic pressure and the rate of the cooling of the lava rocks when they form underwater. So keep that in mind. This is underwater we're talking about. That means that submarine basalt are not suitable for potassium argon dating. Now, how do they date a lot of these things? How do they date lava rock? With exactly that, potassium to argon. So the same rather significant problem is also true for helium dating. The decay of uranium and thorium produces helium. For example, the radiogenic argon and helium contents of 3 basalt eruption into the deep ocean from radioactive volcanoes have been measured, and ages calculated from these measurements increase with a sample depth up to 22 million years for lava deduced to be recent. So caution is urged in applying these dates from deep ocean basalt in studies on the ocean floor spreading, right? So now that brings us to the idea, like, wait a minute. When we think about how the age of the earth, the evolutionist goes, well, we need to go over and look at the mid-Atlantic ridge, right? Because we see the older dates farther away from the ridge. So therefore, it must be millions of years, because that's what the dates are doing. Now we know that when lava pours forth and it drops down into the water, it's giving false ages. It's resetting the clock, and it's changing the clock that we're dating and giving us a result that's not true. So now we have the observational evidence of that. So it explains the mid-Atlantic ridge discrepancies that we would, or what we would call discrepancies, that make it appear as though it's millions of years when it's just not. And that comes down to, again, the dating methods that they're using and how they're dating these things. So again, here's the summary of potassium to argon dating. K is just short for potassium. So potassium decays into argon gas at a fairly consistent and predictable rate. Given the evidence that is currently in hand, most of the time volcanic lavas released all or most of the argon gas as left with entirely pure potassium at the starting point, right? So then it's resetting the clock. So now there's a new decay rate that starts to begin as that new potassium degrades into argon. So as lava cools more rapidly than usual, because think about it, lava's erupting as a melting point, is boiling, right? So it's cooling down as it goes. So the rates change. So the usual retention rate of argon gas, and therefore show a small increase in the apparent age, which is fairly insignificant, relatively speaking, usually less than 1 million years. However, argon 40 degressing is inevitably related to the rate of cooling and the degree of hydrostatic pressure in the surrounding environment. Increasing hydrostatic pressure and rates of cooling explain why more and more argon gas is retained by lava produced underwater at greater and greater depths, consistently producing significant elevated apparent ages running into the tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Significant amount of argon gas can be driven into preformed rock and crystals from surrounding environment under high pressure conditions, producing a false increase in apparent age running into the tens or hundreds of even billions of years. This feature is being discovered to be a fairly common problem. So, as you guys know, there's already a lot of problems with it, because as you know, from the early 19th century, the fossils have been a good indicator and are being used as the most accurate method for dating, as long as they correlate with the ages of the given rock based on radiometric dating. But if there are no fossils, like there would be at the mid-Atlantic ridge, then they're just going off the radiometric dates, just like they do with zircon crystals. They're not looking for fossils around the crystal. They're just looking at the crystal itself and dating the uranium concentrations in them. So they believe that because there's so much more uranium in them that haven't decayed all the way yet, that therefore they must be really old. But that's negated by the fact that there's so much helium still inside of them. So they can't have their cake and eat it too. But as you guys know, there's a general perception that there is a competition to get the oldest date, and there's kudos in it by the scientific community. And they admit this. This isn't some creationist saying this. This is an evolutionist talking about this. So they know that they get funding and grant funding and money by getting the oldest date possible for whatever their find may be, whether or not it's a fossil that's in the ground, whether or not it's a relic that they believe might be a human relic or made by a pre-human subspecies, right? It's the oldest date that wins and makes the headlines, and that's how you get your grant money. So when we look at this, let me see if I can zoom this. Good. So of the 8 assumptions, none of them can be considered to be rigorously hold at all situations. Therefore, dating by this method is at best a hypothesis concerning the age of any rock, suit or mineral. It is certainly not a scientific fact. So when we look at the geologic column, we always ask, like, well, why are the oldest dates in the deeper layers? And this is very easily answered by the atomic mass and weight of the elements. You would expect that the heavier elements would sink deeper and the lighter elements would be on the top. And that's exactly what we see. So if the whole world was underwater at one time and everything was being sorted out and the layers were forming, by different tidal waves moving in and out and slowly submerging the entire world, you're going to get different layers of rocks based on the currents of water that are washing in and out. But one thing that would always occur after everything is submerged in water is those denser elements would eventually seep to the deeper layers of the upper crust of the earth and be concentrated in random areas, but they would always be deeper. And what do we see? We don't see a uniformitarianism example of radioactive elements across the crust of the earth or deep in the earth. Instead, it's dispersed randomly on certain continents and less over in some other areas. It makes no evolutionary sense. And then on top of it, we find exactly what you would expect if the world was flooded, based on water hydrologically sorting different elements that would push heavier ones deeper and lighter ones would stay on top. It only makes sense when you're looking at these radioactive elements. And then at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge again, what do we see? What we would expect to see. What's at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge? It's a lava. It's pouring out to this day. You can see it. It's lava that was higher as it pushed up, and now as it's coming down the Mid-Atlantic ridges and it's being pushed out and it's forming the new ground as it leaves in this slow process that we see today, which was faster in the past. What would you expect to see? We would expect to see exactly what we do see. Remember, evolutionary model has moved away. It never really did consider anything other than uniformitarianism, right? So when we look at a global flood model, we are seeing this idea of catastrophism, and catastrophism is shunned when we talk about a global worldwide flood. So they're not looking for evidence for it. So you're never going to find any evidence for it, right? You're only looking to prove your point. You're neglecting anything else that would refute it. So when we look at this little thing here, we have the assumption of man's word going that uranium must have decayed into lead. Therefore, uranium must have been the starting element that formed at the creation of everything during the Big Bang, and over billions of years, it slowly started decaying into lead, and that's why we have some of it today. But as you guys know, that makes no logical sense based on the lead paradox that we have on our very own Earth, and it's starting with that assumption. So if you throw away the assumption and you only go by the observational evidence that we now have, then that can just be thrown away entirely. So there is no need to start with a horrible assumption just to make your point, especially when it's been invalidated. But we have the evidence that is completely necessary to invalidate any radiometric dating as being good for a dating method. I'm sure it's completely fine to say, we looked at this decay rate and the half-life is really accurate. And I agree, it is. It would make a great watch. I would use one. But it doesn't prove that the Earth is millions of years old, because it's, again, starting with that initial assumption. So it's true that the watch is ticking at a particular rate, and that's a fine rate, and it works really good. However, that watch will never tell you when it was made. You can only use it as a watch to tell time, not when it was created. So that brings us now back to the idea of the heat problem. So the heat problem is something that I don't really think I have any images on it, but the heat problem comes from a factor that Walt Brown had, and it was this idea that that God didn't create any radioactive elements. So when he made his prediction, he said, these radioactive elements that are in the earth today, they cause health problems when you're near them. So God must have never made these things. They must have been formed during the flood. So in his flood model, he created that the continent of the United States fell 1 mile down and pressed on the subterranean water that was underneath the continent. And in doing so, created so much heat with that water and the compression and the convection that was pushed down, that it generated supercritical water to force over the rock. And as it was moving past the granite basement level rock with this massive amount of heat, it was going over the quartz crystal, and it was creating a piezoelectric effect. And this piezoelectric effect caused lightning to spark, which is known as a Z-pinch. And it was bolting inside of this water and creating these new super heavy elements, which generated and formed massive amounts of heat. And now the supercritical water burst forth, going through the ocean in some parts and maybe even on land in some others, but most likely the ocean. And as it burst up, going through into the ocean, caused massive amounts of heat. So the heat problem in Walt Brown's model comes from the formation of these super heavy elements from that process. And that Z-pinch process also comes with a reduction of heat, which is called cold repacking. And this is the process where the heat is actually reabsorbed back into itself rather than released. So that's what happens to the machines when they produce this Z-pinch and create these super heavy elements. Now, whether or not that works in nature obviously is yet to be seen, but that we do see it in experimental labs. So that would reduce a lot of the heat that would be dumped into the ocean and into the air itself, creating steam. But there was massive amounts of heat in his model simply from the continent falling down that far, pushing up the water and rock of the crust of the earth and actually shooting debris all the way to the moon. So yes, that does create massive amounts of heat, but it is also answered in his model to a degree, which we now have in a laboratory experiment explaining. And as far as the other model, which is not the hydroplate theory, but the catastrophic plate tectonics, they don't have that heat problem. Their heat comes from accelerated nuclear decay. They already said that the elements were here, but during the catastrophic plate movements of the continents and the subduction going into the earth, there was a friction problem. Now, they would also have to know what subducted, what type of material it was, and then we would have to know a lot of things which we don't. So based on what the rocks are right now at the mid-Atlantic ridge, if that were to be subducted, then yes, that would generate a lot of heat. So it's based on the heat being generated from what we would see today. But John Baumgartner didn't predict that the rocks that we see on the below the ocean right now is the rock that was there. He said there was a different type of a rock, and there was also a different type of viscosity that was going on. So the subduction was much easier, and it could have literally been like an iceberg floating on water, which would have not produced as much heat from convection and subduction and grinding on top of one another. So it would have been much easier to subduct. And it happened just over 1 year, making it very easy. We have another heat example of if you go to the mid-Atlantic ridge and you release massive amounts of heat, all you would have to do is to reduce the ocean over there and let the heat dump into the atmosphere rather than in the ocean itself. That experiment has also been run and shown that it is a great heat sink rather than dumping all the heat into the ocean itself. So there's multiple answers to the heat problem based on the model that we're talking about. And all of the models don't have to invoke any of these things if they didn't want to. Remember, Walt Brown had the idea that God never created them. That doesn't have to be true. I don't know how he expected the planet to even rotate without some type of radioactive source for the Earth's core. I don't know what he said about that. So again, it's here on this channel, we like to take everybody's position and defend them. But we're also going to mention that if they bring up something that they created their own problem for their own model, then we're going to give you an answer to how to resolve that problem, and then also why it's not really a problem at all, because they invented their own problem. That doesn't need to be there, people. It just doesn't. It's not a problem because he invented his own problem. So anyway, if you wanted to mention some things, feel free.
Oh, that's good. That's good, brother. That's good. That is 30 minutes right on the dot. You covered quite a bit, actually. And what I'll do is share my screen now, and I will reiterate a few things and make a couple additional points. So great job, brother. Okay, here we go. So let's continue decimating dating methods and the so-called heat problem, which you did an excellent job, brother, demonstrating that where there are, or I should say, where there is an assumption of a problem, right, there isn't a problem at all. And I liked how you pointed to this evidence that we have directly in the rocks for accelerated decay in the past, right? And two of these lines of evidence are radio halos and fission tracks. Basically, these are microscopic areas of damage that are found directly in the rocks that are ultimately best explained through accelerated decay. Because the types of uniformitarian processes that we observe today, they just simply can't explain these scars. And so, and we see an abundance of these scars, found in these rock formations, granite rock formations, for example. But I'm going to touch more on that a little bit later as it applies to the heat problem. But I want to point to something very simple that basically demolishes this whole argument from dating methods. We just hosted over on Modern Day Debate, our ministry and Modern Day Debate, we collaborated for an epic debate between our flood geologist, Professor David McQueen, and popular evolutionist, King Crocoduck. And so they debated, is radiometric dating reliable? And for many reasons, the answer is simple. And the answer is no. I want to focus a little bit on radiocarbon and carbon dating in general. Because as we know, Matt, carbon decays so rapidly that, let's say, every single atom in the entire universe was made of carbon, okay? It would all decay easily within a million years. Easily within a million years. And so these rocks and these fossils in the so-called geologic column and the layers that make up this column, if they really are millions to billions of years old when we think of diamonds, okay, the hardest substance on Earth, should be the most resistant to contamination. They're formed deep within the Earth and basically shielded from any carbon from the atmosphere. Okay, so any carbon present in the diamonds should ultimately be intrinsic to the diamonds. Okay, so my point is, we have so-called rocks, fossils, coal, fossilized wood, so on and so forth, and diamonds that evolutionists want to say are millions to billions of years old. And if that really is the case, then there should be no carbon detected in these samples. Okay, there should be no carbon left. And yet, when we actually test or carbon date these samples that are assumed to be old, what do we get? We get radiocarbon existing in all of these samples: fossilized wood, diamonds, coal. And what's interesting is the body of scientists for the rate project, the rate team, they sent off all kinds of samples to be tested. Okay, this was tested and it was repeated. And these samples ranged from tens of millions of years old to hundreds of millions of years. In the case of diamonds, you're looking in the billions essentially. And they all came back with a relatively young age. They all had radiocarbon in them. And so, as you can see here in this slide, sourced from Contested Bones, one of my favorite books here, most people are confused about carbon-14 dating. It is often thought that carbon-14 shows how very old things are. And yet carbon-14 is one of the best friends of creationists. Diamonds, one of creationists' best friends. We did a whole video on that a year or so ago now, okay? Actually, carbon-14 usually shows us how young things are. Carbon-14 mostly arises in the upper atmosphere, right? Cosmic ray bombardment, where cosmic rays turn nitrogen into carbon-14. The resulting carbon-14 immediately begins to revert back to nitrogen. Some of this carbon-14 enters into living plants and animals, right? We eat, we consume meats, we consume plants, animals consume plants, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're constantly replenishing those levels until we die. Then there's no replenishing taking place, of course. So because carbon-14 no longer enters living things after they die, the C14 rate, with its half-life being just 55,730 years, this means that no detectable carbon-14 should remain in any biological remains after about 100,000 years. And as I said earlier, if every single atom in the universe was made of carbon, it all would have decayed within easily 1 million years. Okay. And yet we find detectable levels of radiocarbon in fossils and all these samples ranging from millions to billions of years old. So the answer are radiometric dating methods, are carbon dating, for example, these methods employed for deep time. Are they reliable? The answer is no. It is remarkable, but essentially everything in the fossil record contains measurable, notice this, measurable levels of carbon-14. This seems contrary to popular wisdom, but it is widely recognized within the carbon-14 community. Taken at face value, this suggests that the entire fossil record is less than 100,000 years old. I mean, there goes evolution. You can't take your fish to fishermen, your bacteria-like organism into biologists, your pond scum into people, unless you have billions of years old. That's why evolutionists believe, whether they admit it or not, that time is the hero of the plot for, goo to you type evolution. Okay. Many will be offended by this idea, but like it or not, this is what the carbon-14 dating appears to be showing. I want to point out, we've done full videos. We've never gotten any counters, any rebuttals, any refutations, as you know, Matt, where we went over extensively all the rescue devices. I mean, this is a fatal blow. This is decimating deep time. This is decimating evolution. This is a triple whammy, okay? This is decimating dating methods. So we spent a lot of time going over the rescue devices, a couple of them being, for example, contamination. Okay, they've looked at contamination of these samples. That doesn't work. These have been repeated. Many different samples have been sent in. They've been tested, and they come back with, detectable levels of radiocarbon. This isn't just, a couple anomalies. And the question that I would have, and in the debate with Professor David McQueen and King Crocoduck, King Crocoduck was saying, well, we would expect, a dozen or so anomalies. But we have a lot of anomalies. And the question is, how many anomalies does it take before we conclude, these dating methods are a fraud? They're not reliable. Okay. So these samples, though, that they've looked at, they are subjected to very harsh treatments. Okay. They're basically subjected to harsh acids, and contamination is limited essentially. And so, but the most important thing to consider is the fact that these results are repeatable. Dinosaur fossils or bones, coal, fossilized wood, diamonds, basically everything in your so-called geologic column, okay, has detectable levels of radiocarbon. But the big one that they want to point to, and this is the rescue device that old Earth creationists like Dr. Hugh Ross would look to. He looked to it in his debate with Dr. Jason Lau. Dr. Lau did a fantastic job. And they'll claim that there's other nuclear material down where the diamonds are that can basically recharge the C14. This doesn't work. Okay, this has been looked at. This has been analyzed. It's been systematically demolished. Okay, the rate scientists, for example, they looked into this rescue device and they estimated, okay, listen to this. They estimated that you would need 13,000 times more nuclear material in the nearby rocks in order to adequately recharge the C14. Okay, so as you're trying to recharge the C14, and the C14 basically that's being lost, there's no counterbalance. It's kind of like genetic entropy, that we talk a lot about genetic entropy here, where you have so many low impact, nearly neutral, deleterious mutations accumulating, generation after generation, that one or two so-called rare beneficial mutations, they're not going to counterbalance the damage. There's no counterbalance. It's like going up a mountain or a hill, and you take one step up, but then every step you take up, you go 10 steps backwards. You're never going to climb that mountain or hill, right, Matt? So it's the same thing here. You're not going to be able to recharge the C14. You would need far too much material to recharge. And it's unrealistic. These are unrealistic amounts. And these cosmic rays can't reach deep in the earth. Okay, the C14 would just decay away. So that doesn't work. Contamination doesn't work. Again, these the labs, okay, the laboratory, for example, they are applying very, very strict pre-treatment protocols. I pointed out they're utilizing harsh washings, repeated harsh washings in strong acids, and these are the kinds of acids that will literally dissolve anything. Okay. And since these samples, guys, are hit with multiple treatments, this essentially ensures only carbon intrinsic to the sample ends up in the instrument to be measured. Okay. So no, these samples are not contaminated. These are repeated. The so-called recharging of C14 doesn't work. All these rescue devices, they've been demolished, but the critics don't want to tap out. The old earthers and theistic evolutionists, the Bible compromisers, they won't even engage the science, right? Uninspiring compromiser, for example. I mean, this guy, he's almost not even worth the time at this point. So it's all been looked at, systematically demolished. What do we have here? Notice this table. From secular sources, secular data. Young rocks from recent eruptions yield greatly exaggerated apparent ages. So Matt, my question to you, my question to the audience, why should we have confidence? Why should we trust dates derived from rocks of unknown age? When we can't even derive accurate dates of rocks of known age. Yeah, we can't get accurate dates of rocks of known age. We understand when, these rocks were formed, essentially. But then the rocks of unknown age, we're just supposed to blindly trust you. I mean, just have a look at some of this data. 1800, the lava was extruded, and what do we have? 1.6 million years. That's pretty off. 1959, okay, comes back at 8.5 million years old. Look at this one. Over here, 1964, not that long ago, Mount Etna basalt, 0.7 million years old. Okay. This is not good. This is not looking good. 21 million years old. This is all within hundreds of years. Okay. So here's the thing. Young rocks from recent eruptions, they're yielding these greatly exaggerated apparent ages. And so obviously we're not going to trust rocks, dates derived from rocks of unknown age. Okay. Discordant dates abound. Discordant dates abound even in their praised isochron dating method. Look at this. A rock that formed just 85 years ago from a lava flow in Mount Lassen in California, dated to over 250,000 years old. Okay. This type of basalt here Hualala, if I'm saying that right, Hualele basalt that formed between 1800 and 1801, just 200 years ago. Potassium argon dated to 1.6 million years old. A year later, this doctor here, potassium argon dated the same lava flow in Hawaii. The new date indicated it was over 16 million years old. Okay, it's just not looking good for dating methods here. So carbon-14, radiocarbon dating just absolutely demolishes dating methods here. So let me move on to a couple points here, reiterate a couple points you were making, Matt. Fantastic job. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the radio halos, the fission tracks, for example, and these lines of evidence, this physical empirical evidence, right, Matt, that accelerated nuclear decay has occurred. And as we know, byproducts of radioactive decay include helium. You touched on that. Helium's an extremely slippery molecule, yet we find it in zircon crystals, as you were talking about, fission tracks, and radio halos that essentially suggest accelerated decay, probably at creation and the flood. Okay, both periods of time. The creation week was an accelerated week, accelerated processes. Any kind of accelerated decay during that time period would be followed by accelerated cooling. Okay. So at creation, no, there's no heat problem. That doesn't make any sense. And neither is there one during creation. I'll touch on, or at the flood, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. So for anybody not familiar, I'll break it down real quick and then go over a couple of these slides. Okay. Fission tracks. We talk a lot about radio halos, helium, but fission itself is where the uranium atom splits. Okay. It's actually what we get in a chain reaction that produces a what? Well, that produces a nuclear explosion. And two halves of the atom, they fly apart, but because they are so large, they damage the crystal. There's damage occurring, okay? And we can actually see these tracks or these trails where the particles have damaged the crystals. And each atom that decay leaves one track. And you can count the number of tracks if you know how fast it splits apart. Okay, then you can calculate how old the rock was back to the time basically before the track started splitting apart. Okay, so these fission tracks, just picture a rock being hit, with multiple shotgun rounds. I mean, these are scars. This is damage to the rock. This is significant damage to the rock. Notice this: uranium and polonium radio halos thus provide startling evidence of catastrophic geological processes on a young Earth. I've never seen any real sufficient response from the critics on this. Gutsick Gibbon attempted, and we did a full-out response to her response over a year ago. At this point, there's never been a sophisticated rebuttal. Okay, during the year-long flood about 4,500 years ago, sediments were eroded and deposited catastrophically on a global scale. The catastrophe buried vast graveyards of plants and animals, producing fossil-bearing rock layers all over the Earth. Rapid Earth movements pushed up mountains, right? Present processes can't explain the geological features of the Earth today. Meters per second movement of the plates, on the other hand, okay, that can explain the geological features of the Earth. For example, the rapid buckling of the rock strata to basically produce these mountains, okay? And I find it funny, Matt, because a lot of the so-called challenges that are presented to us as young Earth creationists, how are you going to get the plates moving at continental sprint rather than these snail pace movements that we see today? And it's like the heat and energy that they say is a problem is a great way to get the plates moving in the first place, right? And so they want to say, heat is a bug, while I would say that heat is a feature. But more on that in a little bit. I want to finish this here. So rapid Earth movements push up mountains and form granite bodies quickly. Inside these granites, super fast radioactive decay generated uranium and polonium halos. These are so microscopic. Now, there's various models in terms of flood geology where, some flood geologists would say you have secondary polonium radio halos, basically, that may have been produced at the flood, where the majority of them are evidence of accelerated decay processes during the creation week. So you have, granite forming mainly during the creation week, but also some during the flood week. And, there's some in-house debate that's very interesting in terms of interpreting these amazing scars, essentially, that we see in the rocks, that accelerated decay has happened. Accelerated decay has happened. Okay, that's the most important point. And the fact of this actually destroys the so-called heat problem, which I'm going to get into next. Okay, so they are so microscopic that they could be easily overlooked, but their presence in abundance in granite all over the world cannot be ignored. They are exciting confirmation that the earth and its rocks are not millions and billions of years old, as usually claimed, but only about 6,000 years, as God's word plainly declares in the historical narratives in Genesis. Okay, so this is where I want to get into the so-called heat problem, which you absolutely dismantled, Matt. I appreciate it. So there's a lot of heat produced, a lot of energy produced, but there's also so many different ways that the heat is managed. There's not a heat problem. We have heat management. How do we manage the heat? Firstly, the massive amounts of water that existed on the earth during this year-long flood, okay, would have helped basically to shield Noah and the animals in the ark. The critics don't like that one, but that's just one factor in the overall heat management issue and how it is dealt with. Okay, because if you have miles of water, since we use water today in a nuclear reactor to protect and shield things, then this would not only shield from radiation that they say there is, right? This excessive amounts of radiation produced that essentially they'll say would kill Noah, kill the ark animals. This radiation would be shielded, okay? And a lot of this heat would be taken up essentially by the water. And at the fountains of the Great Deep, we have supersonic steam jets, but we also have, the fountains of the Great Deep, water erupting from underneath in these subterranean vents. Okay, I like how in the hydroplate model, you have the lubrication of these plates, because rather than just mainly magma coming up, you have water coming up from underneath the earth. And we see evidence of this because we have water shooting up into the oceans. So if water is shooting up into the oceans, obviously it's coming from further than that. And we have evidence for these subterranean vents basically in the earth that have water. There's a lot of water underneath the earth. And so this water that came up would take a lot of this heat up into space. Okay, there's a lot of different heat sinks, but here, when it comes to the radio halos and the fission tracks, okay, you'll notice this from Dr. Andrew Snelling and also Mike Ord, that since radio halos and fission tracks are obliterated, so notice this. The evolutionists, uniformitarians, and we also did a video recently with Professor David McQueen and George Bond, our flood researchers here at Standing For Truth Ministries. They did a whole couple-hour video, heat problems of the secular model. Okay, they say we got a heat problem. They've got multiple heat problems, and they have yet to deal with those heat problems. Okay, our brothers here, they've been doing a lot of research on these, basically these blobs or these massive slabs of material in the earth that have not warmed up or melted, and could have taken down or taken up a lot of the heat, as well as the core. We don't know the temperature of Earth's core before the flood. And so a lot of that heat might have been taken down into the core. But most importantly, we have this evidence for radio halos and fission tracks. And this is my favorite argument, because the evolutionists, they complain about a lot of the explanations that I'm putting forth right now, right? They'll do calculations and say, oh, they don't work. It only takes up a fraction of the heat, right, Matt, as you know. But they've never dealt with the fact that these radio halos and fission tracks, they exist, and yet they're obliterated at relatively low temperatures. Okay, so to be more detailed, essentially, and I highly recommend this book here that I got this citation from. But as it applies to the heat problem, as I'm explaining, is when we heat a rock, okay, the damage in the crystal actually repairs itself, which results in the obliteration of the damage that we see. Okay. And Dr. Andrew Snelling, he explains it well, because he's looked at an example in Los Alamos, I think it is, where they had a drill hole, and they noticed that the more you go down, okay, you go through granite, where you can now see these halos, and you can observe these halos, this damage to the rock. And the more you go down in depth, the in situ temperature actually increases. And when you get to about 150 degrees Celsius, you know what happens? Well, the radio halos actually start to fade away, and then they disappear. And the reason why this is because the heat has energized the crystal to the point where the particles of the crystalline structure have repaired itself. And so, if there was no rapid cooling during the flood, okay, during these accelerated processes, because we have the critics that are essentially saying that this heat would have melted the crust, boiled the oceans, the radiation would have killed Noah, killed the ark animals. Well, if there was that much heat, and that heat did not be taken up into all these various heat sinks, and there was not some kind of supercooling, well, we wouldn't have these radio halos and fishing tracks, because they would be obliterated, but they're there. And the best explanation for them is accelerated nuclear decay. You see how the evolutionists, the uniformitarians, the actualists, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Okay, we wouldn't have this evidence for accelerated nuclear decay, and yet we do. And so this tells us that, when it comes to heat management, there's a whole lot of ways essentially for us to get rid of this heat. And another thing too that I find hilarious is these critics. What they'll do is they'll complain. Eugenie Scott, Biologos, Reasons to Believe. They'll complain that, there's just too much, too many fossils, too much evidence for dead things on the planet today. Too much coal, way too much oil, natural gas for the young Earth creation model to explain. But yet what they're doing is they are assuming that the way the Earth is today is the way it was in the past. We understand from scripture, we understand from the fossil record as well, and determining how environments were in the past. The Earth was a lot more green. The Earth was filled with animals. I mean, just look in the fossil record, the amazing biodiversity that existed. Okay, the amount of plant material that existed. Well, coal, oil, and natural gas, especially natural gas and oil, in labs, they've shown just with heat and pressure, it can be produced rapidly. And so what do you have? You have a pre-flood world that is the perfect battery to absorb a lot of this heat and utilize this heat to rapidly produce what? Coal, oil, and natural gas. So you have these guys, for example, from, we had that debate, Reasons to Believe. It was Dr. Kenny Rhodes at the time representing them. He debated Dr. Kent Hovind, old Earth creation versus young Earth creation. That was his major argument. There's just too much coal. Well, wait a minute. There's too much coal, apparently, too much oil to be explained in the young Earth creation model. But then you want to say that there was too much heat and energy produced during the flood, when that heat and energy can be utilized to rapidly produce the coal, oil, and natural gas. Utilize the plant material, the dead material, all the dead animals. Okay. Utilize everything to rapidly produce this stuff. So no, we have a ton of different heat sinks. There's even a model called the hypercane model, where you have these massive hurricanes during the flood, during the worldwide flood, that would have taken much of this heat up into space, because we understand that hurricanes, they are excellent at dumping heat and energy into space, because when a hurricane goes over the ocean, the temperature actually drops. And so convection is a fantastic way to move heat quickly, to move heat rapidly. And so we understand there would have been a lot of convection during the flood year. And just all of these lines of evidence, and what you were talking about earlier, Matt, how you'd have basically this counterbalancing effect, which I'd like to hear your thoughts on now when it comes to Z-pinch. And I looked at the time here. So there you go. You did half an hour. I did half an hour. And this has been comprehensive. That is our goal, brother. So overall, what are your thoughts? And just when it comes to this heat problem, there's so many different ways to take up the heat, to utilize the heat, to get the plates moving, to rapidly produce coal, oil, and natural gas. We have this evidence in the rocks for accelerated nuclear decay with fission tracks, radio halos. Okay, they wouldn't exist. They would have been obliterated if there was not a way to get rid of this heat, utilize the heat, or have some kind of supercooling mechanism. They wouldn't exist, but they exist. They're there, and the uniformitarians can't deal with them. Okay, Matt, what are your thoughts on that? And can you cover this concept of Z-pinch, for example, and how there would be something, I think it's called cold repacking, where you'd have basically a canceling out effect of any kind of excess heat that would be damaging. Go ahead, brother. Oh, I think you're on mute. Let me unmute you. Okay, you're good.
Yeah. For example, going back though to the topic of the heat, yeah, there is not only a lot of different ways to be reabsorbed, but yeah, there was obviously heat that was generated. There's no doubt about that. Why? Because we realized, we found in genetics that all the aquatic life died at the same time. So there was a global bottleneck of not just land life when the flood happened, it destroyed the life in the ocean as well. Why do you think there's things like megalodons that are missing and these prehistoric creatures and whales that are no longer with us? Something killed them. It had to have been the heat. You know, nothing else that we can think of did it. So obviously massive amounts of heat would have done the job, but it didn't kill all of them. It just killed most of the life. And a lot of it was buried in the flood. So we know the global bottleneck happened in genetics. So now we want to find it in the geologic record. We see it. The only discrepancy that we see is based on the idea that the Earth is old because of these radiometric dates. And again, there's multiple ways to that the planet could have absorbed the heat or gotten rid of it, but it also comes down to how much heat was generated. And again, that goes back to what was the plates, what was going with convection, what was going on. Is the Z-pinch even needed? Well, in Walt Brown's model, it is needed. Because again, it goes down to, he believed that the radioactive elements had to be produced in the flood. So he needs Z-pinch to do that. But why? There is no need for radioactive elements to have been there. Like Donnie mentioned earlier, God created things during creation week. Accelerated nuclear decay could have happened in the first week before there was even life on the planet. And the first days of creation, when he's creating the foundations of the world and he's creating the mountains and everything, guess what? That's accelerated. That's when the process was really happening and occurring. There was no life to even hurt, so it wasn't a problem. And then we get to the flood, and then there's plate tectonic movements, and that's what I would say the heat would be generated from. But if we want to defend Walt Brown's position, then yes, if Z-pinch occurred during the flood in his model, there's a process called the cold repacking, which is a process where the heat is actually reabsorbed into the surrounding elements when it's formed. The very granite would have taken it back inside of itself because granite would have absorbed it. The crystalline structures, which would have been producing this electrical effect, would have been reabsorbed back into the granite as the heat was generated from the electricity that came from the granite. So the heat would have been produced and then absorbed again. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And that's very helpful in the model because, as we know, when granite melts, it doesn't become granite again. So if evolution was true and the Earth formed from lava and meteorite bombardment, well, our planet's basement rock wouldn't be granite. It would be rhyolite. Instead, we see granite. So granite had to have been there. Granite was there during the flood. It didn't get hot enough to melt the granite, or at least not all of it. Whatever was touching might have melted and then subductive. But that's assuming that granite was passing over granite. We don't know if that's the case. We don't remember. Baumgartner said it wasn't granite that was subducting. It was a different type of rock that was there first. Then it subducted, and it only slowed down when it came into contact with the new material that we see there today. So unique. And if I could just share my screen, because I wanted to touch on one more thing that are two more things that you were talking about. Let me open a window. Sure. Try that one.
You're good, brother. You're good.
Okay, when we go to the age of the Earth, they're dating it based on the evidence of radiometric dating of meteorites. This is why they originally predicted something totally wrong. They thought that the moon came from the Earth, and they dated this idea that the moon came from the Earth later on. The concept was that the Earth, the Earth produced the moon in the Pacific Ocean basin, and it departed from the Earth, and then as it left, that's why it's moving away from us, it eventually got trapped in our orbit, and we kept it. Then we tested the moon's meteorites based on radiometric dating, and of course, they dated much older, because guess what? There's no atmosphere in space. There's different radioactive elements on the moon that have different types of rates of decay. So the evolutionists had to say, well, that idea is gone. So they said, maybe our moon was produced when a Mars-sized planet slammed into Earth and then broke a chunk of the Earth off with that Mars-sized object, and it formed the moon. That's why it has different mineral compositions. But these are all assumptions based on the idea that their formation of radioactive material is true, and it's just not. Look at what happened when they dated. They sent off the same samples to different laboratories. They found that radiocarbon dating, only 18% came back with the same date. The rest of them all failed. They didn't come anywhere close. Then they did the carbon dating conclusions of in the 81. They sent them out and found that half the dates were completely rejected. And that's complete rejection. And then we go over to thermoluminescence dating, which is a very popular method and used by evolutionists sometimes in debates. And guess what? Their margin error is up to 50%. 50%. That's horrible. Imagine going to a roulette wheel and taking your life's inheritance and putting it on the table and saying, I'm willing to bet my life money on this roll. Would you do it? No, come on, 50%? You're not going to trust that at all. But yet you're going to believe these dating methods that have less than a 50% accuracy? Come on, guys. You can't put so much faith in it. That's what they're doing. They have more faith in their dating methods than they should, which tells you what? Their evolution concept and mindset is a religion. They want it to be true. All this conflicting evidence that refutes the idea, they just ignore it. They don't want it to be true. They're anti-science. Why? Because if they were scientifics, they would go, ooh, show me that. Let me learn about that. I'm going to study that and figure out what's really going on here. Why are there discrepancies? That's what we did. We believed in evolution, and now look at us. We looked at the evidence and said, wow, that doesn't make any sense. I can't believe what they told us was just nonsense and a lie. That's why the science textbooks are replaced every 5 to 10 years. What you learned in school is not even taught anymore because it's just been replaced with nonsense that's going to be replaced in 10 more years. And they're just going to say, well, we learned more. Yeah, no, what you did is you've been falsified time and time and time and time again. That's not science. When you get multiple falsifications wrong, that shows you how weak your model is, how weak your theory is. If it's not getting anything accurate, throw it away.
Now, one thing we do here, Matt, as you know, is when we model build, because we strongly believe here in Standing For Truth Ministries in refuting the evolutionary model, just dismantling all their best arguments. That's why we've written books specifically dealing with their favorite lines of evidence, the Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, for example, and just the other 15 books or so that we've put out, including our books on the flood. And so we'll combine the strengths of each flood model, right, and discard a lot of the weaknesses that aren't necessary based on false assumptions, right? So we have a combined model essentially, and that's presented in a lot of our videos. Which model you think out of these two prevailing ones, the CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, versus the HPT, the hydroplate theory, which one of those models do you find personally to be the stronger one in light of its strengths and weaknesses?
Ooh, tough questions. With Walt Brown's predictions, he has over 60. Most of them are on the flood model, and he's nailed most of them. That's pretty good. That's hard to say that the other model is better. However, with the new scientific results of the catastrophic plate tectonics, where they've drilled down and they pulled the cores of each different continent up, and they found the consistency of each different epoch layer, resulting in a different layer of the flood occurring. So now we can know exactly when each layer formed from the flood, and that it was actually from tsunamis coming in rather than a slow saturation of just water rising up like Walt Brown's, you have to mix them. You just have to. It's so good to mix the two, because I think they're both amazing now. I was more Walt Brown, and then I started going like, I can't explain the layers of the flood with Walt Brown, so I have to use the other one now. So
it's basically taking, instead of just discarding one over the other, it's taking the strengths, the positive, the pros of each model and creating a better model. Because I find, unfortunately, I don't know, what do you think? Do you find that some that are strictly HPT and some that are strictly CPT, it's like they don't want to consider any of the models. They just want to either discard one and only defend the one. You know, maybe they have, you know, some investment in either one, rather than actually analyze both models and say, you know what, right here's a pro, right here's a strength in model 1, here's a strength in model 2, and combining them to make a better model. Do you understand what I'm saying, brother?
Yeah, absolutely. It's because it's science, right? You create your model, it's got to beat they consider them the opponent, right? Yeah, I got to be a better model than them. But we don't have to do that. We can take the strengths from both. We're not trying to compete with anybody. We're trying to make the most logical sense. We come to our own conclusions. We can read between the lines. We're used to reading all kinds of different evidence and being like, interesting, let's evaluate this.
Well, one thing that I like, and correct me if I'm wrong, one thing that I like about the HPT model specifically is that from the biblical starting point, right? The Bible tells us that at the beginning of the flood, the fountains of the great deep were broken forth. And to me, that would suggest that most of the water of the flood came below the Earth's crust in subterranean chambers circulating the entire planet, where most of the water was underneath the Earth, and it's basically been switched. Water here, and then a switching there. And not that I recommend this movie, but we have used the visuals in I think it was called Noah back in the day with Russell Crowe, but they had a cool depiction of the fountains of the great deep breaking forth, and just just these massive jets of water just basically coming up into the air, taking rocks almost into space once they reach escape velocity, just showing the power of this water that's essentially under the earth coming forth, breaking through the earth. But the CPT model, and here's where I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, rather than looking at all of that water coming up through the fountains of the great deep, don't they look to most of that just being magma with a little bit of water?
Correct. They believe that the most of the ocean of the flood is what we look at with the oceans and the icebergs, and that the mountains formed and it just rearranged the topography of the earth, as where hydroplate theory is the water that comes up, which makes sense because we read in the Bible that the water also receded back into the earth. That means if it came, it had to have come from the earth if it receded back into the earth. So it's the only logical position we get from that. Correct. That is a discrepancy that they have for sure.
Well, and that's why in that specific department of the model, portion of the model aspect, I should say, I like the idea of the fountains of the great deep erupting in such a way that you have water shooting up, right? And the original crust of the earth, due to this tremendous force, is cracked like an eggshell, right? It's fractured. And we actually find evidence of this cracking, Matt, as you know, in the mid-oceanic ridge, okay, the Atlantic ridge, where you follow this all around the entire globe, much like a seam on a baseball. And this is obviously best explained by the original fracturing of the earth during the bursting of the fountains of the great deep. And so what you have, and tell me your thoughts on this, brother, when it comes to the friction from the plates moving due to the fountains of the great deep breaking forth, in the hydroplate model, you have the water, rather than mostly magma in the CPT model, lubricating the plates as they slide across the earth, reducing the amount of heat produced through friction. Does that make sense? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Walt Brown doesn't have a heat problem with the friction at all. That's only the catastrophic plates. His heat is only from the generation of the radioactive elements. Correct. Only heat generated from the movements would be at the end of the flood, when there was a dipping of the continental crust and it was forming volcanoes all over the world.
Very good. Very good. Well, listen, brother, this has been comprehensive, hour and 15 minutes. Anybody who's watched this video, please share this around. We're going to be doing more like this, okay, where we get right into it. It's going to be a different topic every time. Radiometric dating is obviously a hot topic. We're confident that this one is going to be, it's not going to be countered by the critics, put it that way, because the rescue devices, they've been dealt with. We dealt with them here. There is no heat problem, guys. There's a heat management issue, and we've showed you a number of ways to manage that heat. So great presentation, Matt. This was a lot of fun. Please, guys, share around this video. The truth is important, and God bless. Hope you enjoyed the video.